Good morning, everybody. I'm Austin Willett, CEO of Different Strokes, and a very warm welcome to the final day of our 2021 virtual conference. It's fantastic to once again have you with us this morning. This event has been sponsored by Bolt Burdon Kemp, and not only are we very grateful for their support throughout this week, but I'm delighted that this morning we're joined by Laura Barlow, Associate Solicitor in the Adult Brain Injury Team at Bolt Burdon Kemp. Before I hand over to Laura, just a couple of things of housekeeping. This call is being recorded, the session is being recorded, but to reassure you, everyone is viewing in complete anonymity. The only people who will appear on screen will be myself and Laura. You should see towards the bottom of your screen a couple of functions. You'll see the chat function there, so please do use the chat function to say hello to us, let us know where you're watching from, and any general comments that you have as well. If you do have specific questions though, please don't put them in the chat function. Instead, please use the Q&A function. And then if we can, time permitting, we'll see if Laura has time to answer those questions towards the end of the call. If you do have questions, I'd recommend that you ask them as you go along as well, to avoid a last minute rush towards the end, because then we might not be able to answer them. With that aside, with no further ado, I'd now like to hand over to Laura. Laura, welcome.
Hi, Austin. Thank you very much for the introduction. We feel really privileged to have had the opportunity to sponsor this conference, and I have attended several of the sessions this week that have been really fantastic. So I think Different Strokes have put on a really interesting and useful conference, and I hope I can add to it by giving you a view of things from a legal perspective. So I'm just going to share my screen. 1 second. Hopefully everybody can see that. As Austin explained, I'm a solicitor, and I have been for more than 10 years, and I work in the adult brain injury team at Bolt Burdon Kemp. I count myself to be very lucky, primarily because I have a job I love and one where I get to help people reclaim and rebuild their lives following a brain injury, which of course includes stroke. So what would I like to talk to you about today? Firstly, the kinds of legal issues that you might face following a stroke. So I'm not an expert in all of the legal issues that you might face after a stroke. In fact, I'm only an expert in one of the areas that I'm going to talk about. But the work that I do is often very involved, and the other legal issues that I'll mention often come up during the life of a case. So as solicitors working in injury litigation, we need to be able to identify those issues and signpost to the appropriate expert in that area of law, which is why we get to know a bit about the other types of legal issues. And the second thing that I would like to talk to you about is rehabilitation after a stroke. So talking about the timing of rehabilitation, and what goes into building a rehabilitation package where there are funds available. So first up, legal issues. This is the list of the areas of law that might be relevant to issues you could face following a stroke. And there are probably others too, but these are the ones that I come across on a more regular basis. So they are public law, employment law, court of protection, family law, and injury litigation, which is my area of expertise. So I'm just going to talk through a little bit more detail about each of these areas. So public law governs the conduct of public bodies. So you might have a public law issue if you disagree with something a public body has done incorrectly or hasn't done at all. So for starters, having a stroke can have an overnight impact on a survivor's finances and ability to earn. So that means that people who have previously never needed to claim benefits may need to apply. And the benefit system can be very complex and confusing. The benefits that you might be entitled to following a stroke very much depend on your individual circumstances. But stroke survivors are commonly eligible for universal credit if they have a low income or are unable to work, and personal independence payments, and those are for people with long-term health conditions or disability. So if you're not happy with the outcome of a benefits assessment, you might wish to appeal the decision, which is when you might need to take some professional advice or some support from another organisation. There are a number of online calculators that can help you figure out the benefits that you're likely to be entitled to. And there are also a few avenues for free advice on benefits, such as the Citizens Advice Bureau, and there are charities that can help you with that as well. So when we're instructed on new cases, we always consider whether our client is receiving the benefits that they're entitled to, and we offer our clients a benefits review with a professional trusted advisor that is an expert in benefits to ensure that our clients are receiving everything that they're entitled to in terms of benefits. So alongside benefits, stroke survivors might face issues with their social care and or their healthcare provision. So it might be that somebody with high care needs has been assessed as requiring only 1 or 2 hours of support per day. And if that is not enough, it can place a really unreasonable expectation on the stroke survivor's family and friends to bridge that gap in support. Also, care packages that have been in place are sometimes cut, or a local authority doesn't agree to fund an injured person's assessed needs. So in terms of that, if you feel that there's an unfair decision, again, it might be necessary to consult specialists to assess whether there's a right to appeal for that. So finally on this slide, in terms of entitlement to treatment and rehabilitation, most, if not all survivors have, stroke survivors have an initial period of rehabilitation, but you may feel that you could have made further gains with additional rehabilitation. So you might also think, you know, there's a type of treatment that I haven't had that might improve my condition, but the NHS won't fund that. So these are the kinds of issues that a public lawyer might be able to assist with. And in fact, specifically in terms of the rehabilitation of young stroke survivors, so that's stroke survivors under 65 and under, there's a recent national clinical guideline for stroke that recognises that general stroke services don't always meet the needs of younger adults who have suffered a stroke. And the guideline recommends that acute stroke services should recognise and manage the particular physical, psychological and social needs of younger people with stroke. And they should also liaise with regional neurorehabilitation services that specialise in the neurorehabilitation of young adults. And just through my cases, I got the feeling that these guidelines don't always appear to be followed. So I've made a few freedom of information requests recently on this issue, and the responses that I've got back so far indicate that probably around 5% of younger stroke survivors are getting specialist rehabilitation, which in my opinion, of course, is not good enough. So again, that might be an issue to be raised with a public lawyer if you think you're not getting that specialist rehab that you need. So that was public law issues. So on to employment law. So most people who have had a stroke will need to have at least some time off work, and for many, work will no longer be possible. So if you're having a period of time off work, you might be entitled to sick pay, but that's likely to be limited. And if your ongoing difficulties are severe, there might be no prospect of returning to work, in which case you may be compelled to retire on grounds of ill health. However, if you are able to return to work, there are a number of things to bear in mind. And the first thing to remember is that there is a duty on employers to make reasonable adjustments for employees with disabilities. So many people returning to work after having a stroke will have a right to reasonable adjustments. And it's really important that their employer takes that duty towards their employees seriously. So what are reasonable adjustments? Well, there isn't a set formula for what constitutes a reasonable adjustment, but the important thing is to tailor adjustments to the individual's specific needs. So a few examples of reasonable adjustments for physical problems after a stroke might include things like specialist equipment. So for example, a one-handed keyboard if you have one-sided weakness, or a supportive chair. For cognitive issues that are ongoing after a stroke, things that might help in the workplace could be having a buddy for support, or allowing extra time for completing work, and possibly ensuring a calm working environment. These are the kind of things that might be helpful. Other reasonable adjustments for things like fatigue could include having a later start time, having incorporating regular breaks into the working day, shorter hours, fewer days, a place to rest. So things like that. Like I say, there's no set formula, but it's an individualized approach, and there are various things that could be considered. Of course, some employers are great and others are not. So if you're returning to work after a stroke, you might face issues such as a failure to make reasonable adjustments, and possibly disability discrimination. So if you have issues with your employer, it's important that you get advice as soon as possible. And I've put on the slide a few of the places that you can go to for advice. So Citizens Advice, ACAS, and employment law specialists can help you with those kind of issues. So on to the third legal issue that I wanted to talk about. So that's the Court of Protection. So very briefly, the Court of Protection exists to make decisions for people who can't make decisions for themselves, so they lack capacity. And there are two types of deputyship that the Court of Protection grants. There's a property and financial affairs deputyship, and that deals with people's money and property. And there are personal welfare deputyships for health and welfare issues. So deputies can be professionals, so there are many solicitors who act as deputies, or you can also have lay deputies, so that's usually a family member who's appointed. In the cases that I deal with, we most commonly see property and financial affairs deputies, and they can be especially important if somebody's going to receive a large sum of money that needs to last them for the rest of their life. So that money needs to be protected so that it can be used appropriately. And a person who has had a stroke might need a deputy if they're struggling or completely unable to make those important decisions for themselves. So that's why I mention it here. So I also wanted to have a chat about family law issues following a stroke. So we know only too well that stroke doesn't just affect the person who had the stroke. Whole families are affected, and there are various family law issues that can arise after a stroke. So marriages and relationships can be put under immense strain following stroke. The stroke survivor may be frustrated that they can't fulfill their family role the way they used to. Their partner may have taken on the role of carer, and other additional responsibilities, which can be hugely stressful for all concerned. And unfortunately, this can sometimes lead to separation or divorce, despite the best efforts of all concerned. So those are obviously issues that you would need to consult a lawyer about. In terms of children, younger stroke survivors, of course, are more likely to have young children. or children of school age, and caring for those children is likely to be more challenging after a stroke. So if a parent or a guardian is unable to look after their children following a stroke, additional support or alternative arrangements may need to be considered. I think that people who work with stroke survivors know that families need support after stroke. And so, again, if you have a family law issue after a stroke, it's important to consult with specialists for advice. I'm going to talk to myself away a little bit because the sun's come out. It's blinding me. There we go. Okay. And so the final category of legal issue that I wanted to talk about that you might face after a stroke is injury litigation, and this is the area that I specialise in. So the stroke cases that we deal with are often medical negligence claims, although strokes can sometimes be caused by accidents. For example, if a person suffers damage to a blood vessel in their neck as a result of a car accident, that can subsequently lead to a stroke. I've listed on the slide a few of the types of medical negligence claims that we see relating to stroke. So these can include a failure, and this could be by a GP, to monitor and treat high blood pressure. If the blood pressure situation was treated, there's a possibility in some cases that the stroke may never have occurred in the first place. In terms of a failure to recognise symptoms of stroke and admit for further treatment or investigation, these cases are sometimes where you've got a paramedic or emergency department that hasn't recognised common warning signs of an impending stroke, for example, a TIA or symptoms of an actual stroke. So this particular issue does seem to be slightly more relevant for younger stroke survivors because, as you probably know, stroke tends to be seen as a disease of older people. And the widely publicised FAST test for stroke, so face, arm, speech, time, is supposed to ignore age, but it doesn't always appear to be the case. So younger stroke survivors may be overlooked and dismissed as having something else. And I do have a few cases currently where this has been an issue. So sometimes when a stroke is suspected, there are unreasonable delays in confirming the diagnosis by brain scan, which can lead to delays in providing treatments that could have made a significant difference to the outcome. So the kind of treatments that we're thinking of there is things like thrombectomy, which is surgically removing a clot from the brain, or thrombolysis, which is the drug therapy. And they're very time sensitive. They have to be done as soon as possible. Sometimes we see strokes caused because of other substandard medical treatments. So, for example, neurosurgery or pain management procedures can cause stroke as well. So if we take on a case, we have to obtain medical evidence from independent experts in the appropriate areas of medicine to tell us, was this substandard care? And if it was substandard care, did it affect the outcome for this person? Are they in a worse position than they would have been if there wasn't this substandard care? So we obtain evidence, and if that evidence is supportive, we would seek to formally pursue the case. And then if and when liability is resolved, we can request funding for rehabilitation for our clients' future needs, which I will talk about in a minute. Clients who have a successful case will be compensated for their past financial losses and for the injury itself, as well as their future needs. Okay, so that was a run through a number of different legal issues that you might face following a stroke. And I think my main piece of advice is that if you come up against any of these issues, you should try and get some support as soon as possible. It's usually when things are left that they seem to develop into bigger problems. It doesn't necessarily always have to be a lawyer, but there are charities and places like Citizens Advice and ACAS with the employment law that can help you. So this is onto the second sort of part of what I wanted to talk about in a bit more detail, and that's rehabilitation. And most of you probably know that early intensive rehabilitation with specialist programs is clinically proven to be the most effective way to improve an individual's function, ability, independence, social integration, all of those things. So we are lucky to have a number of specialist stroke units in the UK, and I think it's generally accepted that stroke services have improved a lot in recent years. But resources, of course, always an issue. And following the initial period of rehabilitation, which is usually 45-minute sessions, 5 days a week while somebody's in hospital, with speech and language therapists and physiotherapists, the rehabilitation tends to be less following that, and that initial period of rehabilitation, although useful, might not have been enough. So stroke survivors should always have a review at 6 months, which is to see how they're progressing, to identify any needs that are unmet, and to provide further rehabilitation if that's seen to be necessary. And then following that, there should be a further review at 1 year, and then annually thereafter. It's usually by the annual review, usually by a neurologist after that. But you see that following that initial period of rehabilitation and the reviews, there are some people who feel that they have further rehabilitation needs that would enable them to function better. So where else can you turn to for rehabilitation if you think you can still make improvements, but there is nothing more available to you from the public sector? So you might have medical insurance, or your own funds, or the funds of a generous family member, which might enable you to get some private rehabilitation. And that's a possibility, but it's not going to be a reality for everybody. If you have a successful litigation claim, you can get interim payments to fund rehabilitation. And any good solicitor should be trying to get you an interim payment at the earliest possible opportunity. So if liability is admitted, you don't have to wait until the end of the case for funds. You can get rehabilitation as soon as is possible. And the advantages of private rehabilitation, however it is funded, is that you can get quicker access, it's less likely to be time limited, and you probably have access to a wider variety of specialists to meet individual rehab needs. If none of these, if you're not entitled to further NHS provision and you don't have access to a private rehabilitation, there are a number of an increasing number of online rehabilitation services, and that's partly thanks to the pandemic, that might help to some extent. So these sorts of services are generally provided by charities like Different Strokes, and there are lots of support groups as well that might help with overcoming or talking about some of the psychological outcomes following a stroke. So I'm sure that some of you are aware of those types of offerings. So if you are able to get a privately funded rehabilitation packages, I just wanted to have a look at what that could possibly look like. And as you can see from the list on the slide there, it can be a lot of people in a number of different specialist areas. And I've put case manager in bold because I would say that having a great case manager is probably the key to getting the best possible rehabilitation package, because they're the person who puts it all together and manages it all, hence the job title. And yeah, there are lots of really great case managers out there, and lots that are specialists in brain injury and are experienced at working with stroke survivors. So if you are looking for a case manager, I would say that you should look for a specialist, and ensure that they're a member of the British Association of Brain Injury Case Managers. So having rapport with your case manager is of crucial importance, because case managers can be around for quite a long time when you have a private rehabilitation package. And you know, there are, like I say, there are lots of great case managers, but you might need to meet several case managers before you find the right person for you. It's a very you know, it's a very specific, personalized thing. What would happen if you're setting up a rehabilitation package is that the case manager, who is someone that's often from an occupational therapy background, would do a very thorough assessment of what your needs are at that time, and then start to build up a package of treatment and support around those needs. So it can include, you know, many of the specialist areas listed on the slide. And then once you have your team up and running, the case manager might arrange for multidisciplinary team meetings. So your specialist team are discussing your progress with each other, which can help personalize the rehabilitation journey further and help you to make further gains. So I've talked about case managers. Support workers are sort of the day-to-day support with daily activities. I'm sure I don't need to explain neurologists. Everybody who's had a stroke should have seen a neurologist. Neuropsychologists deal with the psychological aspects following a stroke, and neuropsychiatrists, psychiatric issues following any type of brain injury can be an issue. So it can be often very important to get a neuropsychiatrist on board as well. And then occupational therapists, I think everybody who has had a stroke will have seen an occupational therapist at some point, and they can help with the practical aspects of daily living, aids and equipment, and techniques for dealing with things. Physiotherapists, you know, there's physiotherapists who also specialize in hydrotherapy as well, which can be particularly useful for people who have had a stroke. And then, yeah, there are numerous others, and there are lots of others that I haven't put on the slide, but there are lots of people who can help. And the idea is that if you have a great rehabilitation team, you will be able to make the best possible recovery from your stroke, which will enable you to live your best life. And I mean, like I said at the very start, I feel really privileged to be able to do this job. And I truly believe that with the right support, people can live full, meaningful lives after stroke, and, you know, just meet their full potential. So just a few key points. There's not much to say here, but I think my take-home points would be, if you're facing any of the legal issues that I talked about, you should seek advice and support for legal issues as soon as possible, because, like I said, if the longer things go on, the more problematic they can become. Yeah, trying to get the best rehab package that you can, because it could make all the difference to how you can live the rest of your life. So on this slide, I've just put a few links to some blogs and articles that I've written recently that touch on some of the topics that I've spoken about today. So this top one, but I thought only old people had strokes, is a blog focusing on young stroke and the specific challenges that can be faced by young stroke survivors. The money worries after brain injury one is quite self-explanatory. It talks about benefits and ways of accessing funds. Returning to work after stroke is an article about how to support somebody returning to work following a stroke. Parenting after brain injury, again, that's self-explanatory. And yeah, feel free to take a look at those. I know the slides will be circulated, I think, next week. And if you, we're going to have some time for questions in a minute, but if you've got any other questions that we don't get to today, my contact details are on the first slide, so we can, you can always contact me. So yeah, so that's all from me, and I'm going to stop sharing my screen now so that if there are any questions, Austin can ask them. There we go.
Laura, thank you so much. That was absolutely fantastic to hear you go through all this. We've had a number of questions come through,
Okay.
both in advance and today as well. I'll do my best to get through as many of them as I can, particularly ones that I think will be relevant for most people. So first of all, if I could just ask you, why is there so little follow-up of all the therapies for a stroke survivor?
Yeah, so I think, like I said, there's a standard sort of initial period of rehab, and then there's a 6-month review and the year review, and I think it is partly a resource issue. So there's the entitlement to those annual reviews, but unless you have private funds, that I think it's primarily a resource issue, that the NHS just doesn't have the provision to provide the intensive rehab that people might need following that initial period, which is unfortunate. But that's why I think I tried to stress in the presentation that if you feel you have a further need for rehab that you haven't had, there are avenues for trying to access that. And going back to the public law stuff that I talked about, if you feel that there's been a wrong assessment and there's something that you should be entitled to that you're not getting, then I would recommend trying to take some specialist advice on that and seeing if you can appeal any decisions that have been made.
Thank you. Okay, so the next one in it, I'm on a temporary contract and my employer won't make any adjustments. I have been told I have to be able to do my job 100% and be value for money. Yeah. I work as a TA in a primary school. Can they do this?
Yeah, well, I think, like I said, there is a duty. It's under the Equality Act, and there's a duty on employers to make reasonable adjustments. So it's not a choice for the employer. It's a duty. So I think that person, yeah, if they're being told, I'm sorry, we can't make any adjustments for you, may need to ask somebody, a specialist in employment law, to advise on their position. Now that it's reasonable adjustments, so it depends on the needs of somebody. If there's something that is going to cost an employer thousands of pounds, that might not be a reasonable adjustment, but there are lots of things that can be done that don't cost any money, that can help people return to work after a stroke. So yeah, I can't give specific advice on that, but I think that person might want to ask ACAS or Citizens Advice for some initial advice on what's happening, because it sounds possibly as though the employer isn't meeting their duty.
Thank you. I think this whole concept of reasonable leads us quite nicely into the next question that's been asked. Does reasonable also include allowance for the interests of the business, where an employee whose contribution to the business is reduced? In a small business, there may be less ability to accommodate. Does this fall under reasonable?
Yeah, and I think that's the case. So yeah, so small businesses will have probably fewer resources to make adjustments. So it's what is it reasonable for that employer as well. So if you worked for a huge multinational company, then they're probably likely to be able to spend more money on adjustments than if you're working in a small company that has, you know, five people in it. So it's it does come down to the individual circumstances, but there, you know, there are adjustments that can be made that don't cost anything. So it doesn't always have to be something really expensive.
Sure. The next one, if I come through, I work for the NHS and have a stressful job. I am desk-based and able to work remotely. I have cortical hand syndrome, so typing and writing are challenging. If I reduce my hours, it will affect my pension. Should I look to retire on ill health and then consider a part-time role with less stress in the future? I'm 48 with many years service.
Yeah, well, it sounds like that person is in quite a difficult position, and it's a difficult decision to make. I don't know if you feel your employer has done all they can to make it easier for you to work, those reasonable adjustments. So that might be the first thing to consider. I mean, I can't give you advice on the actual, like the pension stuff and the employment law stuff, but I feel like I'm saying the same thing every time, but getting some advice from somebody who has expertise in employment law might be the way to go there. So ACAS, citizens advice, and employment. I think there are employment law specialists who will just have an initial chat with you on the phone as well, with no sort of, you know, obligation to sign up with them or anything.
Thank you. Next one, why is there so little support for me, an unpaid full-time carer, to get a short respite, e.g. 2 or 3 nights break?
Yeah, so I mean, I really do feel for people who are carers, and often they're thrust into that role without any warning or experience. One of the things that I didn't cover on the benefits slide was carers allowance. So if that person isn't already in receipt of carers allowance, they might need to look at that. That's obviously financial support, is not respite. In terms of respite, I know that, you know, there are charities that sometimes offer respite for carers, and there are carers support groups. I don't think there's much of a public offering for respite for carers, so I think probably looking towards the charity sector for help with that might be the best option.
Okay, thank you. We've had a few questions come in that are in the broad area of people's initial treatment in hospital in the acute stage. So firstly, we've had, I didn't get thrombolysis. Does that equate to a basis to launch a claim?
Well, yeah, I mean, every case has to be looked at individually by experts. So with thrombolysis, what we would have to do is look at the details of the case. When do we think the thrombolysis, well, was this person a candidate for thrombolysis in the first place? If so, by what point should they have had it? And if they, if it should have been, well, this person didn't get it, but if that person should have had thrombolysis within 2 hours of the onset of their stroke symptoms and they didn't, we then need to ask a neurologist, what effect would that have had on that person's outcome? If they'd had the thrombolysis at 2 hours post-stroke, would they have made a better recovery? And if we can say that probably they would have made a better recovery, then they might have a basis for a claim. But you can't give it, you can't really give a broad brush answer to that question, because it has to be based on that specific person's circumstances. And yeah, there are people who might make a good recovery following thrombolysis, and somebody else might not make such a good recovery. So you have to get that individual specialist report to tell you what the likelihood is.
Thank you. Another one regarding hospital care. Is there a formal definition of unsafe discharging from hospital? And related to that, how would you begin querying failure to treat high blood pressure prior to contacting a solicitor?
So I think there's probably 2 questions there. So the unsafe discharge, I don't know if there's a definition, but if somebody felt that they'd been discharged and they shouldn't have been, that would be a situation where you would need to get, from our perspective, an expert to comment on at that point of discharge, was it safe to discharge that person, or would reasonable doctors have kept that person in hospital? So from a legal perspective, that is what we would look at. We'd have to look at that specific situation and ask the question. And the second part of the question, which I've now forgotten. Sorry.
How would you begin querying failure to treat high blood pressure?
Yeah, the high blood pressure. It depends on who. A lot of cases that we've dealt with in the past, failure to treat high blood pressure has been a GP issue. So if that was the case here, you would have to, we would have to instruct a GP expert to look at that person's medical records and say, this person should have been on blood pressure medication, from a year sooner, and if they have been, then they would have avoided the stroke. So it's it's getting, well, you'd need a GP opinion on the failure to treat, and then you would need a neurologist's opinion on the outcome of that failure to treat.
Yeah, thank you. Moving on, one or two questions, I guess, regarding kind of post-discharge and life after stroke. First one is, I've not seen a neurologist, but a stroke consultant. Should I see both?
The stroke consultant probably is a neurologist who's specialised in stroke. So they might be called a stroke physician, but they probably come from a background of neurology. So we work with several experts that we instruct for our reports, and their title is stroke physician or stroke specialist, but their area of specialism is neurology, and they specialise in stroke.
Right. Hopefully that clears.
So probably, so that should be the case there.
Yeah. In your experience, is the norm that we don't claim or get what is available? Services don't seem to be advertised. We find out by word of mouth mostly, and then it's slow and difficult to get. I think this question is suggesting that although there are services out there, they're not really talked about. So they're difficult.
I think that sometimes, I think that possibly people who speak up and complain might get more services. And that the thing that I was talking about with the specialist rehabilitation for young stroke survivors, I just don't think that is really happening. And if somebody was to say, well, I know about that there's this guideline and I should be getting specialist rehabilitation, then maybe that would prompt that referral. And I know that there are so many different guidelines and things, and you sort of feel for the people who are dealing with the commissioning and the services, that it might always be hard to get everybody everything that they need. But I definitely think that speaking up and saying, I think I'm entitled to something and I'm not getting it, might help to access further rehabilitation.
Sure. I think we'll just have one more,
okay.
And we'll finish with one that I'm sure will resonate for a lot of people, and probably to a certain extent is slightly the elephant in the room as well. If you feel you need litigation for medical failures, would there be any help with legal costs?
So there isn't legal aid for medical negligence claims anymore. Legal aid only now applies to children's cases. So the types of cases that we deal with, usually our cases are funded on a conditional fee agreement. So it's on the TV they call them no win no fee. So we investigate cases, hoping that we will be able to bring a case for somebody, and if at the end of the investigation there isn't a case, we write off our costs, and if there is, then there's a success fee to be added for the risk that a solicitor takes in taking on a case where you might not get paid. So there are ways of funding, and people don't have to pay out of pocket for legal costs. But there isn't legal aid. It's not publicly funded. But it doesn't mean that there's not the access to being a solicitor. So anybody can contact a solicitor, and there should be a way of funding the case that doesn't put that person financially at risk or out of pocket.
Thank you, thank you. Like I say, we've had a lot of questions in this morning. I haven't quite been able to get around all of them, but I've taken the ones that I really feel, you know, are most relevant and resonate kind of with everyone on the call. So, Laura, thank you so much. It's been fantastic to have your expertise this morning, and thank you for taking the time also to answer through all the questions as well. We really, really appreciate it. I assume if you're happy for people to email questions into us, if they think of anything else that I can.
Yeah, of course, I'm happy. Yeah, if anybody's got any other questions that didn't get answered, I'm happy to answer them. Brilliant.
So please do forward any other questions that you have. You can send them to us at info@differentstrokes.co.uk. We'd be very, very happy to forward them on to Laura for her to respond to you in due course. Thank you. So that brings this talk to an end, and we've just got one final session this afternoon in this year's virtual conference. I know this is going to be an absolutely fantastic discussion. It's a panel session this afternoon chaired by Ranj Palmer, our Chair of Trustees, with a range of experts in areas such as life after stroke, aphasia, physical recovery after stroke, clinical neuropsychology. We've got a fantastic panel of experts, and where else are you going to find all your experts together in one place free of charge? So please do join us for this session at 2 o'clock this afternoon. Once again, thank you to Laura. Thank you all for your time today, and we'll see you soon. Thank you.